Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today I want to talk to you about dwarves in Norse mythology, as well as the elves, which may well be the same thing. Now, for this video, as for so many of my others, you have to kind of leave aside the very Tolkien-inspired fantasy definitions of dwarf and elf that we mostly operate with in our TV shows and movies and games and novels and things like that. Tolkien's dwarves, or our typical fantasy dwarves, are not terribly far maybe from the Norse mythical concept of a dwarf, but the elves are so ambiguous in Norse mythology that different fantasy series make up a lot of different meanings for elf, and especially the difference between the so-called light elves and dark elves. And we really find only the ambiguity in Old Norse and none of the solutions that are similar to the fantasy literature of our day. So to begin with, the basic vocabulary here, we have dvergar, which means dwarf, the plural is dvergar, and then we have olver, which means elf, the plural is olvar in Old Norse. And these are cognate, they have the same origin as the English words dwarf and elf, respectively. Now, one of the most interesting, or I should say consequential maybe, maybe not always interesting, monuments to the Norse belief in dwarves is actually in the most important, arguably, certainly the first and most cosmically significant poem in the Poetic Edda, the main source of Norse mythology, and that is Völuspá. And what we have here is a list of dwarf names, often called the Catalogue of the Dwarves, much like the Catalogue of the Ships that takes up so much of, I think it's book 2 of the Iliad. But kind of like that Catalogue of the Ships in the Iliad doesn't particularly add much to our appreciation as modern readers of that story, the Catalogue of the Dwarves doesn't add a whole lot, probably even less, to our appreciation of Völuspá, the grand story of the creation of the Norse cosmos and its destruction at Ragnarok. But here are the dwarf names that we find there, stanzas 10 to 16. I will read in Old Norse and reconstructed pronunciation, and then follow that with fairly literal Old Norse to English translation. Þar var mótsognir mætstur orðin dverga allra, en durin annar, þeir mannlíkon morg gorðu, dvergar jorðu, sem durin sagði. Nui og niði, norðri og suðri, austri og vestri, alþjófur dvalinn, bívor, bávor, bombur, nori, on og onar, oi, mjóðvitnir, vegar og gandolfur, vindolfur, þróin, þekkr og þórin, þrór, vittur og litter, nor og nyróður, nú hefi ek dverga, regin og róðsvíður, rétt talða. Fíli, kíli, fundin, nóli, hefti, víli, hannar, svíur, frór, hornbóri, frægr og lóni, árvangur, jari, eikin skjaldi. Mól dverga í dvalinsliði, ljóna kindum, til lofars telja. Þeir sóttu frá salarsteini, árvangasjót, til Jóruvalla. Þar var draupnir og dógþrassir, hór, haugspori, hlevangur, glói, skirfir, virfir, skofiðir, ói, olfur og yngvi, eikinskjaldi, fjallar og frosti, finnur og ginnar, það mun uppi meðan old lifir, lang niðjatall, lofars havat. Now I follow the Codex Regius version of Voluspa, by the way, and numbering these stanzas, and here they are in my published translation of the Poetic Edda. Then they made Motsognir, they is the gods, the Aesir, at the beginning of time. He was the lord of all the dwarves, and next they made Durin. They made many man-like little creatures, dwarves of the earth, and Durin named them. Nui and Nithi, Northri and Sudri, Austri and Vestri. By the way, most of these names are pretty difficult to interpret, but we can interpret some of them. Northri, Sudri, Austri, Vestri are north, south, east, and west. Althjover, Althief, Dvalin, delayed, Bivor, Bovor, Bombor, Nori, On and Onar, Oi, great-grandfather, Mjodvitnir, that would be like mead witness or mead monster, mead the drink. Veger, drink, and Gandolfur, that is Gandalf, that is one of the attestations of that name in Old Norse. It would mean something like magic elf or magic staff elf, perhaps monster elf. Vindolfr, wind elf, Throin, Thekr, and Thorin, that'd be something like dried up. Thror, Vitter, and Litter, that'd be like wise and color. Nor, corpse, and Nyrodr, new advised. Regen and Rothsvidr, that would be like lord and counsel wise. Now I've named the dwarves correctly, but she keeps going, she being the Volva, the Cirrus who's narrating this. Fili, Kili, Fundin, Noli. Fili could be related to the file, the smith's tool. Noli to nail, of course something smiths make. Fundin would mean found. Hefti, Vili, Hannar, Svi, or Fror, Hornbori, horn bearer. Frager and Loni, Aurvanger, Yari, Ekenskjaldi, meaning Okenshield. Notice he's not the same as Thorin here. Now the names of Dwalin's family, the dwarves descended from Lovar, as men tell, the ones who left their stone halls for a home on Jorvolur. These were Draupnir, and the same name as Odin's ring, and Dolgthrasir, Hor, Haugspori, Hlevanger, Gloi, Skirvir, Virvir, Skovir, Oi. Some of these repeat from the first list. Olver, Elf, and Yngvi, also a name of the god Freyr. Ekenskjaldi again, Fjallar and Frosti, Fither and Ginnar. The names of these dwarves, the descendants of Lovar, will be famous as long as the world exists. Well, maybe they haven't been. And in fact, we're not particularly clear why this long series of dwarf names gets inserted here in the middle of Voluspa, in the middle of the Volva, the Cirrus telling us about the creation. But what were the dwarves like? We've got some examples of their names. Well, there's a fairly common expression in Old Norse. Someone is dvergar of vox, a dwarf with regard to size. That seems to always imply that someone is short, so it does seem that dwarves are shorter than human beings. We also see terms like manlikon, meaning like, it's a little bit of a diminutive, like a thing like a man, a little thing like a man, used for dwarves, including in Voluspa on that list just now. The most comprehensive discussion of what the dwarves are like is actually in the prose Edda. I'd like to emphasize that the prose Edda, which is the work of Snorri Sturluson, is in many ways a secondary source that's interpreting the same old poems in the Poetic Edda as we are, but Snorri is a secondary source who's 800 years closer to when those poems originated, so he may sometimes know things that are obscure to us. Anyway, in my upcoming translation of the prose Edda, this is what Snorri has to say about the dwarves. The gods remembered how the dwarves had come to life in the earth, down in the soil, like maggots in flesh. The dwarves had been created first and had come alive in the flesh of Ymir, the first living being, a Jotun or giant. And they were maggots, but the gods decided to give them human intelligence and human-like form, but to live still inside the earth and inside the stones. And indeed, we do see them living inside of stones quite literally. For instance, in the story Sorlathottir, where Froya sleeps with a few dwarves, she actually finds them living inside of a stone and working in a workshop there. They are great craftsmen, so many of the gods' treasures are made by the dwarves. I've discussed in another video how the dwarves made Mjolnir, for instance, Thor's hammer, as well as Draupnir, Odin's ring, Skidbladnir, the fabulous ship that can be folded up and put in one's pocket, among other treasures. Siv's golden hair. being another. And they do seem to be mostly presented as all male. So they grow up out of maggots in the earth, out of the flesh of this primordial living being Ymir. Now and then we see hints about female dwarves. There is a girl dwarf in Egil Saga Einhenda, the saga of Egil One Hand, one of the weird mythical heroic sagas. In Fafnismal, Fafnir, the dying dragon, says that some of the Norns, the beings that determine fate, are from the family of Aesir. He says some of them are from the family of elves, Olvar, and then he says some are Dötr Dvalins, daughters of Dvalin, one of the early dwarf names. But anyway, aside from these small hints that there may be female dwarves, all of the significant dwarf characters in myths and sagas are male. So, for example, we have probably the most famous, Regin, the foster father of Sigurdur, in the Volsung material, is said to be a dvergar. In Reginsmal, or in the prose preceding it in the Poetic Edda. Interestingly, he's also called a Jotun in that same poem. So that implies that maybe dwarves are considered to be somehow related to the Jotnar, possibly because of the way they grew up in the flesh of the original Jotun Ymir. Or maybe these categories are just really vague and shifting and anomalous in Old Norse, and I think maybe that's more likely. We see, besides the fact that they're excellent smiths who make great crafts and tools and weapons, that one of the really defining characteristics of dwarves in Norse mythology is they shapeshift into animals, or sometimes just live as animals. The Volsung legends are full of these, with, for instance, Otter, who is literally an otter, but a dwarf, Andvari, who is a fish, but a dwarf, and Fafnir, who becomes a dragon, but is originally a dwarf. So there's something about this, and these aren't the only dwarves. This is just the ones in the saga of the Volsungs, but you see several examples of them turning into animals. So they have some kind of special magical or other relationship with animals and often live as them. Other important dwarves include the aforementioned Northri, Vestri, Austri, and Suthri, north, west, east, and south, who hold up the four corners of the earth. Now, what could be the difference between dwarves and elves? So we see, like I said, a fairly defined idea of what a dwarf is. Fairly defined, for Norse mythology, keeping in mind that the poems that are preserved in the Poetic Edda aren't trying to present a very consistent picture for us, even within one poem, but certainly between the different poems. But we see a fairly consistent picture of craftsmen who are probably short, who live inside of rocks, who shapeshift into animals or live as animals. Elves, we're much less certain about. Most of the time that elves occur as a word, that word olver, elf, or olvar, plural, it is an alliteration in a poem with Aesir. So what's med osum, what's med olvum, what is with the gods, what is with the elves, is a question that's asked in two poems in the Poetic Edda. And in many places you see these words paired. So it often seems like the word is just chosen to alliterate with Aesir, to mean some kind of perhaps broad category of lesser supernatural beings that associate with the gods, perhaps including dwarves. And then we also see other places where the word elf is used basically just for alliteration, but sometimes in distinction to dwarf. One of the great examples of that is actually an Ulvismol, which is said to be that is a poem in the Poetic Edda where Thor comes home and finds a dwarf who wants to marry his daughter Thrudr, and he doesn't want to marry his daughter to this dwarf, so he keeps the dwarf talking by constantly asking him what is the name of this thing among different peoples or different beings. So he'll say, for instance, what do different beings call the ocean, and Alvis, this dwarf, all wise in translation, will say, for example, stanza 24, humans call it ocean, gods prefer the name sea, Vanir call it restful harbor, giants say eel home, elves call it ore place, the dwarves say deep, deep sea. But in each one of those, the word for the beings alliterates with the word for the thing that they're calling this. So for instance, dwarves alliterates with dupe and deep, deep sea, both starting with D. So it seems like the choice of the word elf, at least in poetry, is largely governed by the demands of the meter and alliteration, rather than by any kind of specific idea of what an elf is. It's kind of interesting, if you look at the order of poems in the Codex Regius, you can see some intelligent design in what's put where. Völuspá comes first, that's general lore about creation and Ragnarok. Then you have 3 poems of Odin's wisdom, Hávamál, Vavþrúðnismál, Grímnismál. Then you have a poem about Freyr, Forskirnis. Then you have 4 poems of Thor as hero, Horvarsljóð, Hymiskvíða, Lokasenna, and Thrymskvíða. And then you have Völundarkvíða and Álfismál between those poems that are clearly about the gods and the Helgi poems, the first poems that are clearly about a human hero. And the only thing that seems to keep those 2 poems together, Völundarkvíða and Álfismál, is that they're about elves or dwarves. Álfismál is about this dwarf, who I'll come back to in a moment, Alvis, who's giving Thor all these alliterating lists of names. But Völundarkvíða is the only story that I'm aware of, after a long time studying this stuff, in which a major character, speaking character, is an elf, identified as an Olver. Völundr, the great smith, right, like a dwarf, is identified as an Olver or elf in stanza 10 of Völundarkvíða. But he is also, to quote the prose introduction to Völundarkvíða, Völundr was, as far as men know, the most capable with his hands of all the people in the old sagas, and he is a great craftsman, which implies to me maybe elf and dwarf are fundamentally the same thing, or at least you can call some elves dwarves. Dwarves are maybe part of this broad category of sort of lesser supernatural beings that are encompassed by elf. But Snorri adds kind of a complication to this when he talks about a difference between so-called light elves and dark elves. Let me read this to you in Old Norse in addition to in my translation, so you can get some of the difficulties with this passage. Again, this is Snorri in his prose Edda. Han skal få av svartolvum að þeir skulu gera af guli sifju haddan svo skal vaksa sem annað hår. Eftir það fór Loki til þeirra dverga heita Ívaldasunnir. This is when Loki, for evil's sake, basically for the lulz, has cut off the hair of Sif, Thor's wife, and we read then, he had to go to the dark elves, black elves, Svart Olvum, dative plural of Svart Olvar, black elves, and get them to make Siv a head of hair made of gold that would grow like other hair. And so Loki went to the dwarves, who were named the sons of Ivaldi. So this looks like black elves, Svartolvar, and dwarves are the same being, or they are at least overlapping categories. That is in the part of the prose Edda that's called Skóldskaparmál, where Snorri tells that story, probably written before the part most people read, which is Gylfaginning, which is arranged as the first section. And in Gylfaginning, Snorri says this: Så ein staður þar kallaður Úlfheimur. Þar byggir fólk það ljósálfar heita, en dökkálfar búa niðri í jörðu, og eru þeir ólíkir þeim synum, og miklu ólíkari myndum. Ljósálfar eru fegri en sólsynum, en dökkálfar eru svartari en bik. There is a place there called Elfhome, Úlfheimur. The people who are called the light elves, Ljósálfar, dwell there, but dark elves, dökkálfar, note not the same word as Svartolvar, which is used in Skóldskaparmál, dwell further down in the earth, and they are not alike in their appearance, and even less so in their activities. The light elves are more beautiful than the sun, but the dark elves are blacker than ink. So he distinguishes between light elves, which live in Elfhome, Olfheimr, but then dark elves who live down in the earth. Now, is it possible that these dark elves or black elves are the dwarves that are vulnerable to sunlight, like Alvis and Alvismal, who Thor keeps talking all night, just giving all these lists of alliterating names, till the sun comes up and turns them into stone? And are Ljós álfar the ones that can actually stand being out in the sunlight, like most dwarves that we read about? Because Alvis is very unusual in being a dwarf who's vulnerable to sunlight. Most of the time we read about the dwarves as being out during the day and it's not any issue. So is that actually what's going on here? Again, do elf and dwarf mean the same thing, or are they at least potentially overlapping, with elf maybe just being a broad category for lesser supernatural being than God, maybe not opposed to the gods like the Jotnar? I think that's quite a possible scenario. So when we think about the treasures of the dwarves, whether we're thinking about Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, Gulinbursti, the golden glow-in-the-dark boar that Freyr and Freya seem to enjoy, or Gungnir, Odin's spear that will always come back to him no matter where he throws it, or the chain that binds Fenrir, the wolf that will kill Odin till Ragnarok, the chain that is made out of things that don't exist, like women's beards and fish's breath, and the sinews of bears, and the sound of a cat walking. Maybe these, and also the great swords of heroes like Gramr, Sigurd's sword that's made by Regin the dwarf, and other swords and other weapons made by many dwarves in the mythical heroic sagas. Maybe what we're looking at is the work of Olvar, meaning broadly supernatural beings that are less than the gods, but in some ways, especially their ability to just make cool stuff, greater than us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you did, there are more than 270 other videos about Norse myth, language, culture, etc. on this channel. I've also translated the Poetic Edda, as well as the Saga of the Volsungs and the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Those are also available as audiobooks narrated by me. My videos are available for free, and I make them in beautiful places in my Rocky Mountain homeland of Colorado and Wyoming, but they are not free to make in terms of time and effort, and the education that went into these presentations over decades. So I hope that if you enjoy these, that you'll consider becoming one of my supporters on Patreon. That does help me a lot in continuing to make these videos. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.